Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dr. James Herrera Brooks, and it is my pleasure and privilege to serve as the Melanie Trent DeShutter Library Director here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I'll challenge any of you to say that 3 times quickly. It's getting more and more syllables as the days go on, I feel. I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture, which is featuring historian Scott Moore and his most recent book, The Witch of Pungo, Grace Sherwood in Virginia History and Legend. And before we begin, I just want to say how wonderful it is to see both familiar and new faces here. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here to support our institution and, of course, Scott's incredible work as well. I'm also glad that the weather has been suitably miserable and gloomy today. It makes me feel at home, and it also provides a perfect backdrop as we prepare to delve into a world of witchcraft and the supernatural. So it'll be very spooky. Today's lecture is also doubly special for us, for it is one of many in a long tradition in collaboration with the Society of Colonial Wars in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and some of their members are down here with us today to support us. The Society was founded in 1894 to commemorate the role of Americans from Virginia who served in the military and in high civil positions during the colonial period. We are delighted that the Society supported us with today's lecture and with so many others in the past. Thank you all for all of your support and all that your members do to support the important work of our institution. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Before we begin today's lecture, I just want to give you some notice of some upcoming events. This one's coming a little advanced, I feel. This is for an event on September 7th, 2024. It's our upcoming Conrad M. Hall Symposium for Virginia History. This is going to be a full day of presentations, panels, and tours that highlight groundbreaking research into Virginia history, all around the theme of making and creating, which kind of underpins some of the exhibitions that we've had this year. It's going to feature, especially, the historian Liz Varron, as she discusses how 3 Southerners remade regional identity in Reconstruction Virginia, and which will draw heavily from her most recent and award-winning book on James Longstreet. So please make an effort to be there. It's going to be a really special day. In terms of something a little more short-term, our next lecture is going to take place at noon on August 8th, and this one is going to be one that you're not going to want to miss. Please join us for an insightful and an entertaining lecture by Marcia Zug, drawn from her latest book, You'll Do, A Southern History of Marrying for Reasons Other Than Love. I think it's going to be entertaining and engaging. Before we move on to today's program, I just want to ask you all to pause for a moment and just check your pagers, mobile phones, whatever you might have in your pockets that can make a noise and otherwise disturb either our speaker or all of our wonderful guests who are here today to listen to today's lecture. And with that said, I'll make a start. When Grace Sherwood was ducked in the Lynnhaven River during her trial for witchcraft in 1706, she became a foundational part of Virginia's folklore and culture. People have shared stories about the Witch of Pungo for generations, and to many, she remains Virginia's witch. Thanks to the popularity of these legends, the reality of Grace Sherwood's life and trial is often told using a blend of fact and fiction. And this is why we talk about mobile phones, because I just heard one. This afternoon's lecture will reveal the history behind the legend using original colonial records, many of which have been previously undiscovered. Our speaker today will describe the life of Grace Sherwood, her family, and her accusers. It will also embed her trial within the broader history of European and North American witch trials in an effort to uncover why so many people thought that Grace was a witch. Here today to unpack this fascinating story is Dr. Scott Moore. Scott is an associate professor of history at Eastern Connecticut State University, and his research explores the development of identity and the way legends, folklore, and history shape that identity. He's a native of Virginia Beach, like Grace Sherwood, although I've made a mistake there already, and is the author of Teaching the Empire, Education and State Loyalty in Late Habsburg Austria, and of course, most recently, The Witch of Pungo, Grace Sherwood in Virginia, History and Legend, which is going to form the basis of what promises to be a very excellent talk today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Moore.
So I'd like to thank James for that wonderful introduction, and for everybody at the museum for hosting me, for the society for helping make this possible. And also I'd like to point out the museum here and their library was very helpful with a lot of the research for the book. And so I am doubly grateful that not only they helped the book become possible, but then are supporting me with this by giving me this opportunity. As was just said, if you were to compare the titles of my two books, you'll say, what? Those two things don't go together. And I think it's worth starting our discussion today by explaining essentially how I even got to this project from my sort of normal realm of where I spend most of my time as a researcher. If you were to look at what I do as a European historian, what I'm most interested in is what you could think of not as history, but as historical memory. In other words, how do societies remember their past? How do they tell stories about their past? How do those stories and those remembrances shape the way they think about themselves, their society, their culture, their neighbors, and the world around them? And it's hard not to spend your time thinking about how other people do those things and not have that bleed into the way you see your own world. And having been a native of Virginia Beach, having grown up near Pungo, having had family that lived in Pungo, I was obviously very exposed to the legend of Grace Sherwood for most of my childhood. And at some point, I was able to come across one of the numerous social media posts that pop up about her. And all of a sudden, I was just thinking, this will make a really interesting cultural history. And then I was thinking of working on that gradually over time. And then a small little event I'm sure nobody remembers called COVID happened. And even though I was able to sort of get out in the world by 2020, it very much slowed down my ability to get to Europe to do research for several years. And so what was going to be a gradual side project gradually became the primary project I was working on. So that way I would have research to keep me busy. And it's been a very interesting book, and it's been a very rewarding project to work on, not the least because I get to share with folks like you who are taking time out of your day to come listen. And what I started with, if you were to look at the project, is actually the second and third parts of the book, which look at the evolution of her legend, the evolution of her cultural legacy. But obviously, you can't look at those things without knowing what actually happened. And so that's where I ended up with the first third of the book, is essentially what can we learn about this strange witch trial in Virginia? The challenge is, and I'm going to, as we move to this sort of first very romantic era slide from the 1820s of Witch Duck Creek, for those of you familiar with Virginia Beach, you will notice, first off, it doesn't look like that anymore. It's sprawling traffic. But there is still a Witch Duck Road, and the area at what is called Witch Duck Point has been Witch Duck or Witch's Duck or whatever variation of witch and duck you would like to have for well over 200 years at least, probably more. The earliest sighting of it is from the 1820s. And ultimately, this exposes the fact that Grace Sherwood's ducking has had a long-lasting cultural legacy in Virginia Beach. And the problem of that when it comes to studying history is that, as we'll make clear in my final 15 or 20 minutes or so of today, the story literally from the time we got those original records of her ducking blended almost immediately with her legend. And so as a historian, you have to rely on written documents and archaeological evidence to reconstruct the past. The challenge, though, is that the history of Grace Sherwood has often been so blended with the legend, it's almost reflexively shared as truth, even though there's no actual foundation in the records. And so when I looked at the first part of the book, and for today's discussion, for the documents that, or for the things that I'm looking at as history, if I cannot find an actual colonial document that says it, or a historian who is citing an actual source that dates back to the period, I'm lumping that in the legend category because there's no identifiable original source to prove it. The challenge with that is that there are very sparse records from the earliest decades of Virginia's history. Unlike, let's say, the New England colonies, you didn't necessarily have a robustly engaged clergy that spent time writing and fighting with each other like the Puritan colonies did. There wasn't even a printing press in Virginia till around the 1730s, I think, and there was only one, and it was in Williamsburg. So there are no newspapers. There are no books written by Virginians, published in Virginia, accessible in Virginia. Grace Sherwood and most of her accusers were all illiterate. So even if they wanted to, they couldn't write letters or record diaries. What this means is the one window we really have into Princess Anne County and actually Virginia history during this time are through court records. Now, Virginians spend a lot of time in court suing themselves and all of their neighbors. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff you can learn about society during this time from those county court records. The problem, though, is they are incomplete. Because ultimately you're left with whatever the county clerk decided to record as the window into the trial. And so the example I give always is, imagine 300 years from now if I'm trying to recreate your life and I only have your IRS records and anytime you're in court. And that's basically the window and lens we have for the folks that we're looking at in this trial. But you can still learn a lot, especially as the introduction pointed out, if you incorporate all of the context we have from other witch trials that have happened, not just in Virginia, but in Europe and through the rest of England's North American colonies. And so I think with that context, we can learn a lot. So we do know that Grace Sherwood was born around 1660. I say around because there were no exact birth records kept, but we know approximately it was around 1660. And she lived at the time in Lower Norfolk County, which in the 1690s split into Princess Anne County and Norfolk County. If you were to look, this area up here in the northwest is where she will end up being tried and ducked. This is where the county courthouse was. So it's right about here. And she lived here. And this is an approximation, but it's pretty close. It's actually near an area called Back Bay, which is, if you know the area, closer to North Carolina than the other parts of Virginia, modern day Virginia Beach. I point this out because Princess Anne County was, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, it's just true, it was a rural backwater of Virginia. Which I think is saying a lot given the sort of limited population of Virginia during the 1690s. And she was in the most remote part of that rural backwater. So she was in a very isolated, very small community. It's also notable most of Princess Anne County was settled around here, which, if you know Virginia Beach, is also where all the traffic is. And what this means is there really was no easy way for her to get back and forth from this area. Notice there are no waterways connecting this region to the northern part of the county. So what this meant is getting from here to here would have been probably a day or two journey because she would have had to essentially trek on almost non-existent roads. I mention that because ultimately I just want to reiterate, she's in a very sort of self-contained, relatively isolated community. And so what this means is the people that were around her were essentially the only people she largely interacted with. We know from records that she was the daughter of a very well-respected Midland farmer. He owned about 195 acres of land. His name was John White. He was literate, and more importantly, he was a carpenter. Virginia didn't really have a manufacturing sector at the time, so anybody that had actual skills like carpentry was very valuable. And so I mention this because what it means is if you're to put her in the social hierarchy of her county, by no means was she born into an elite family, but comfortably sort of Midland. And one of the things that becomes very clear is when she marries her husband, James Sherwood, preview for the next lecture about marriages. Marriage, of course, at this point is largely a social economic union. You're supposed to elevate your social status through marriage. And I am not attempting to slander the character of James Sherwood, but by all accounts, by those metrics only, this marriage falls short. James Sherwood does not own land, unlike his father-in-law. He is not literate, unlike his father-in-law, and he has no discernible trade. I'm sure there are other reasons the couple got together, but economic advancement was not one of them. The only thing the couple inherited were from Grace Sherwood's father. And so by the time 1681 rolls around, they live on her father's farm. And we know that all of a sudden the couple begins experiencing economic hardship. This is not abnormal. Virginians were made and broken by misfortune during this period. And so plenty of people experienced dramatic economic decline. And unfortunately, the Sherwoods are one of them. We know this because James Sherwood is sued several times for not paying debts. The couple is also forced to sell off some land. And those things are not shocking in and of themselves. Again, Virginians were sued constantly for not paying back things they owned. What's notable is they were never lending money and they were never buying new land. And that, I think, is notable. I think, again, looking between the lines, if you were to look at the assessment of his estate when he died, you can see through the weeds that, looking at the property he owned, you can see their declining economic status, because you will notice there is a reoccurring word, which is old. That is code for that was inherited from her father. So that means the couple did not really buy anything notable since her father died. And also feel sorry for the poor, mangy, scabby horse, which I can't help but feel like is an unnecessary commentary by the assessor, as opposed to just saying old horse. But so what, and the reason this matters is not because, again, that I'm slandering their character, but we know that people who experience economic decline often are more vulnerable for accusations of witchcraft. And we know that because as people experience economic decline, or if they're poor, they often have to rely on neighbors for help and assistance. They need to beg for assistance in the form of money or maybe food or other things. And we know that, and I'll explain this a little bit more in context, these requests for assistance can often generate friction between neighbors that often manifest in the form of accusations of witchcraft. And I'll explain why some historians may think that in a second. We do know that about the same time in the 1690s that James Sherwood is being sued for not paying debts, Grace Sherwood is in a series of slander suits. If I had to sort of summarize what Virginians were suing each other about, not paying debts will be number one. If you were to look at most court days for county courts, most of them are related to people not paying debts. Slander suits were a close second. This is a small world with a very intimate community. And so Virginians at this time were fiercely protective of their reputation. And so they very often sued anybody that seemed to be besmirching their character. And so what is obvious is Grace Sherwood is becoming the target of neighbor gossip. And so they take 3 of their neighbors to court. The first will be a former constable. So he was basically, he implemented the sheriff's will in his part of the county. So she's suing up. And in fact, they always sued up. I think that shows a certain boldness. And we don't know what this slander was. The court records just say for an act of defamation. Though it is often assumed it's witchcraft, that's actually not clear. So, and I'm not willing to make that sort of supposition. It ends up being solved outside of court. So the couple resolves their differences. The next 2, I also love, this is a photo that was used, or that's in the Virginia Beach collections. And I love it because it shows Grace Sherwood almost looking like an aristocratic woman in her riding attire. This is not the way like colonial Virginians dressed at the time she was alive. And I just love this so much for that reason. But anyway, the second 2 cases were explicitly related to allegations that Grace Sherwood was a witch. She sued one couple, John and Jane Gisborne. John Gisborne was a sitting constable, so good for her for going for the lawman. And in this case, she was contesting the allegation that she had bewitched their cotton and pigs. So she was accused of causing their pigs to die and their cotton crop to wither. The second, and these were heard on the exact same day, so it had to spice up the jury's life because they'd literally just been dealing with debt suits and stuff like that. And all of a sudden you have witchcraft. The second is more fanciful. She was suing a couple, Anthony and Elizabeth Barnes, because Elizabeth Barnes had been telling people that Grace Sherwood had come to her in the night, ridden her like a horse, and then turned into a cat and escaped through their door. Both of these sound outlandish, and yet at the same time, if you study again the history of colonial witchcraft and European witchcraft, these are among the most generic accusations you can make about a theoretical witch. we're in a world where people automatically assumed that witches and witchcraft were absolutely real. This is a world where people had a sense of how illnesses worked, how crop blights worked, how livestock aged and died. And so anything that was unnatural could be seen as signs of witchcraft and some sort of devilry within the community. And so the question was just, how do you find your witch? And so if you were to look again, some of the most generic charges were, a witch cursed my crops, a witch cursed me and made me get sick. Even Elizabeth Barnes's "She Rode Me Like a Horse" is very common. I'm not a psychologist, and we unfortunately can't even psychoanalyze people who died 300 years ago. But we do know that this was sort of a cultural phenomenon where people often had very vivid night terrors or sleep paralysis where they felt they were being essentially ridden by a malignant force. In fact, in Princess Anne County, months before Grace Sherwood was in court for this case, John and Ann Bird sued two of their neighbors for alleging that Anne was riding them like a horse. And so within the area, we know this is sort of a common delusion or common belief. And there are literally hundreds of cases where people are alleging witches do this to them. And so as comical as it sounds to our ear in the 21st century, the Virginians in Princess Anne County were not particularly inventive with their sense of what Grace Sherwood was doing as a witch. And so I think it's worth diving into why might you suspect somebody of witchcraft. And obviously reputation matters. So if somebody has a reputation as a witch, but we also know most allegations of witchcraft, not only in North America, but in Europe, begin in very intimate contexts. In other words, neighbors or friends, people that know the accused witch. And what tends to happen is essentially personality conflicts between the two end up snowballing into those accusations. And I'm going to give you an example from Connecticut in New Haven. That takes place a few decades before Grace Sherwood is in court for slander. There was a woman named Elizabeth Goodman who was poorer and often had to rely on charity from her neighbors. And we know that according to records, she begged cantankerously. So she was not very well regarded. She was seen as unnecessarily combative, unnecessarily sullen and rude. And there were a handful of cases where she went to a neighbor. In one case, she asked for buttermilk and the neighbor said no. And he said, "I need it for my pigs." And she looks at him and says, "Well, it won't do your pigs any good." And the next day, all of his pigs die. She goes to another person and asks for beer. And he says, "I don't have any I can give you." And his beer starts going sour and he can't brew beer successfully anymore. Those associations were enough for people to go, witch. Basically, all it takes is some sort of fight, some sort of conflict, followed by some sort of misfortune for people to connect those dots. So I could imagine a world, for example, let's say John Gisburn's pigs get out and trample Grace Sherwood's cotton, and then she gets in and she confronts him about it, and then the next day or soon after, his pigs and cotton die. Or let's say even he moved his fence to where it went into her land and he planted cotton there, or had his pigs grazing there, and then they died. You could see where that association is going to get made. And they literally lived right next to each other. So we're talking about, next door neighbors. Elizabeth Barnes, what happens if she got in a fight with Grace Sherwood leading up to this very dramatic delusion? And then she has this dream or this night terror. It is possible also that it's just these things happen and Grace Sherwood had a local reputation as a witch, and so they just assumed it was her. But I think based on how close they live to one another and the way from other cases, we can guess that this is that there was a precipitating personal conflict before these things happened. But it's worth pointing out these are slander suits. Grace Sherwood is bringing them to court. She's not being formally accused. She is not going to face any sort of legal jeopardy. She is facing financial jeopardy, because if she loses, she has to pay all of the bills for everybody that came to court. And that's a substantial cost for somebody of her declining status. And unfortunately, she loses both cases. And so the juries find in favor of the people she's suing. Juries at this point were all landholding men that were well respected by the community. And so I think what this shows is as they weighed the reputation of all the folks involved, they basically assumed that, well, Grace Sherwood doesn't have much of a reputation to damage compared to the people she's suing. This does bring a substantial financial burden to the couple, though, because they brought 9 witnesses. So not only did they have to pay for all of the people they sued, they also had to pay for the travel and lodging for those 9 witnesses. And so this was a substantial financial hit. We can tell that her reputation doesn't improve, but she's not in court again for issues related to this for several years. In the meantime, her husband dies in 1701, and so she's now an unmarried widow, which makes her more vulnerable. Also in 1704, she loses the title to her land. This has nothing to do with allegations of witchcraft. In fact, the odds are she didn't pay her taxes. That's the main reason that the colony would take land from somebody. She was never forced to leave. She essentially was a squatter for the next 11 years, and nobody made a move to try to take her land, but obviously in a much more vulnerable and delicate position. Things start going very badly for her in 1705 when she's back in court suing another neighbor for assault. So she sues a woman named Elizabeth Hill because women could not represent themselves in court unless they were unmarried widows. Luke Hill, Elizabeth Hill's husband, was also countersued. So he had to be there representing his wife. And Grace Sherwood sued Elizabeth and Luke Hill because she alleged that Elizabeth Hill attacked her. She was asking for the equivalent of about $7,000 in 2024 money in damages. And this time we can congratulate Grace Sherwood, she won. She actually had the jury say, yes, you were assaulted by Elizabeth Hill. And then they immediately undercut this victory by giving her $66. So a very token nuisance award. And the final insult is the jury foreman never signed the verdict. So it was never official. So she never got to receive her damages anyway. You could see this as an oops, the guy just forgot to sign it. The clerk asked him to come back and sign it, and there's no evidence he ever did. So that means he essentially resisted the efforts to try to make him make it official. Also, I think it's clear it's not an oversight because he had been on several juries. He was a very well-respected sort of part of the court. He knew how this worked. Also, as a historian, it pays to turn the page and read the stuff that comes afterward or before it. There was another assault trial on the exact day, heard by the exact jury with the exact foreman, and they found in favor of the person who brought the suit, and that verdict was signed. So the jury signed all their verdicts that day except hers. And what that signals to me is even if those people didn't think Grace Sherwood was a witch, they thought she was challenging or problematic in her community, and they didn't really like her, but they couldn't deny the fact that Elizabeth Hill had assaulted her. My guess is Grace Sherwood probably still had physical bruises or cuts. And so they had to find in favor of Grace Sherwood, but they wanted to signal that their sympathy was with Elizabeth Hill. This gets more dire, however, because Luke Hill, Elizabeth's husband, immediately follows this up by formally accusing Grace Sherwood of bewitching his wife. And so this is a much more dangerous circumstance because now the county court has to investigate. Witchcraft is a formal crime in English law. And so if you have a formal accusation of witchcraft, they have to investigate it just as they would theft, murder, or other things that are statutory crimes. And witchcraft, there are a variety of punishments that could happen. This is going to sound strange, but in England and England only, witchcraft could be misdemeanor or felony. So there actually was a variety of intensity. As a misdemeanor account, so things like, let's say, fortune telling, making love potions, cursing crops, that would have to be handled by the county court. They handled the jurisdiction for misdemeanors. Felonies, causing someone to die, get grievously ill, that would be heard in Williamsburg by the by the general court, which was chaired by the governor. We don't know what she was accused of doing. It just says she bewitched Elizabeth Hill. And so that leaves sort of a space. Well, what did she do? Literally, that could mean she made Elizabeth Hill have bad luck, or she tried to kill her. There's a range of things that could have happened to Elizabeth Hill. But it is a formal accusation, and now the court has to investigate. The problem is formal witch trials in Virginia were very rare. Slander suits related to witch trials were numerous. There are dozens of cases where people sue their neighbors for calling them a witch. Formal witch trials are exceptionally rare. There is only one known case in Virginia that we can find where a person was convicted of witchcraft. Weirdly, it was a man named William Harding in 1656, and he was convicted by his county court in Northumberland. And in case you're wondering what happened to him, he was whipped and banished. So that was his immediate punishment. There was a case in Princess Anne County where a woman named Alice Cartwright was formally accused, but they didn't find any corroborating evidence, so it was immediately dropped. There hadn't been a case in Princess Anne County where you actually had a formal accusation of witchcraft that had credible evidence that required the court to act. And so they were a little bit over their skis with what to do next. The courts were very formal. They were very established. There were clear statutes and authorities that guided what they did, but they were staffed by county elites. They were not staffed by lawyers. The judges of the court were basically picked by the governor because they were the richest and most important men of the county. So none of them had formal legal training. In fact, depending on the year, at times, the only person with actual legal training in a Virginia court was the Attorney General of Williamsburg. The governor often didn't even have formal legal training. And if you want a case where the prosecutor has a hand or a leg up in trials, he was also the one the governor would turn to and say, how does all this work? And so he's bringing the cases as the prosecutor while also telling the governor how you prosecute these cases and what you're supposed to be doing in these cases. So the Attorney General had a lot of influence. But so in Princess Anne County, they don't really know what to do. So they do what they know the first step is, which is to search Grace Sherwood for witches' marks or devil's marks. This is one of the long-standing folklore beliefs in Europe and European North American colonies, which is that witches are the devil's servants, and when they sign a contract with the devil, he gifts them familiars, these little demonic creatures that will do her bidding. In order for them to sustain themselves on Earth, they have to feed from the witch's bodily fluids. And so this is done through witches' marks, special little teats that are created so that they can feed on them. And so the idea was that you search a witch's body and you find if those suspected marks are there, and that's evidence that you're dealing with a witch. In this regard, they're not only following tradition, they're literally following the sort of way English law is supposed to work. Even though none of them are trained lawyers, there are digest books that summarize English law. The most important is a work called The Country Justice, written by a man named Michael Dalton. And he has a summary on, okay, you have a witch, this is what you do. And the first thing he says is look for marks. The problem is, what are these marks? What do they look like? Even Dalton basically says, well, they could be wet or dry. They could be scabby. They could be raised. They could be sunken. They could hang. They could be black or red or blue or, any other color. But when you see it because it looks weird. And that's sort of the consensus is it's unnatural. So we're back to this world of how do you know when you're dealing with a witch? It's when something unnatural is present. And so there were plenty of people at the time that realized that you could mistake anything for a witch's mark. I mean, you have critics at the time that were like, this is not a valid way to discover a witch. Even people that believed in witches often were like, this, you can't tell. To try to make sure they got it right. First off, to avoid any potential impropriety, the woman was searched by female jurors. They weren't a real jury. They were just they were tasked with searching her. You had several. And also they tried to pick older women or midwives because the assumption was they know how bodies look. And so they're not going to confuse, let's say, a skin tag or a birthmark with witch's marks. But, under the right conditions with the right person, anything could be a witch's mark. And Grace Sherwood had to feel like the fix was in because the foreman of the searching jury was Elizabeth Barnes, who thought she was ridden like a horse and saw Grace Sherwood turn into a cat. Also, what nobody has realized till I started investigating both the Hills and the Barneses, Elizabeth Hill, who is supposedly bewitched, literally came to Princess Anne County with Elizabeth Barnes's family. They all came from the same community in Anne Arundel. So they had been family friends for decades. And not only that, they also lived in the same area. So it's not a shock that under Elizabeth Barnes's careful eye, the searching jury found 2 marks on Grace Sherwood. This is enough in the past to have condemned witches. This is often, a court would see this as irrefutable proof. But we are in 1706. If you do the math, we're about, a decade or so past the Salem witch trials, where at the time as those are burning out, you have lots being written about what was seen as an obvious injustice in that area. And one of the critiques that immediately pops up is the over-reliance on dubious evidence. And so you can see there's going to be hesitation among elites to jump to condemn Grace Sherwood just because of those marks. And so the Princess Anne County Court heroically responds by doing nothing. And they just sort of dither and they hope that this will all just go away. And in the records, they say it was a long time debated what their next step should be. They also are obviously trying to encourage this result because they turn to Luke Hill and they're like, we are more than happy to keep investigating, but you're going to pay for the entire trial. Normally, this is done by whoever loses. And in this case, they're preemptively going, you're on the hook. And you can tell they're just wanting him to make this go away. They're going to say, I was wrong. We'll work it out outside of court. And Luke Hill says, fine, I'll pay for all of it. He is the exact same economic status as the Sherwoods. So it's not like he's rolling in money to finance ventures. This tells me, even if people, let's say up in the courts, may not have thought Grace Sherwood was a witch, Luke Hill definitely did. And he very much believed that she had bewitched his wife. And also, I think this shows that the assault may not even have just been a vendetta, because according to European folklore, if you are bewitched and you know who your witch is, the easiest way to break that bewitchment is to make her bleed. In other words, to assault her, especially in the face, and make her bleed, because the assumption was then all of those familiars will run away from you and start feeding on her. And so think what precipitated all of this was an assault trial, where Grace Sherwood was grievously wounded, likely in the face, by Elizabeth Hill. And so imagine a world where they're sued, they feel like they're justified, and yet the jury still finds against them, even though the verdict was never official. You can see where this might be an effort for Luke Hill to have vindication, to say, my wife was justified in her actions, and because Grace Sherwood is a witch. He's frustrated because the court continues to dither. We started out in March, we're now getting towards spring and summer. So he makes the very bold decision to go over the county court's head and petition the governor directly to prosecute Grace Sherwood. So he gets in touch with the governor of Virginia and basically says, the county court isn't doing their job. I want you to prosecute her for bewitching my wife. The governor, who has no legal training, says, I'm going to let the attorney general tell me what I should do here. And this is a really interesting document, the attorney general's rationale for what comes later. Because what the attorney general does is make two very important statements. He says, the charge is too general. I can't rely on she bewitched me. What did she do? Tell me what she did. Because also remember, that determines if she should be heard by the county or by him in the general court. He also says, I need more evidence. And he basically tells the county court, get to work. He's like, they should redouble their efforts to resolve this matter. Because if you're prosecuting a felony, the job of the county court is to basically gather evidence, pack it all up, and send it up to the attorney general to use as his case. So Princess Anne County now has to operate because they have essentially gotten marching orders from the top. And so they decide, okay, we'll crack out Dalton. We'll do that search for witches' marks again, see if we can confirm that. The problem is the women don't show up. So they ask a jury of women to show up to look, and they don't come. That could mean a range of things. They just didn't feel like making the journey to court, and so they ignored the summons. It could mean they were convinced Grace Sherwood might somehow maliciously attack them with her witchcraft. They might think she was being maligned and mistreated and that this was all bogus anyway. We don't know, but we know the county was having a hard time getting people to search her again. They also go to like the next paragraph of Dalton, and he goes, search her stuff. Because witches have dolls and they have salves and they have, weird little books that tell them how all this stuff works. So search her property for all the secret spaces for where she might be hiding her satanic wares. And so the county orders the sheriff to search her property. They find nothing. And so they need evidence. They can't search her again. They're having trouble getting women to come search her. They haven't found anything that's condemning her in her property. And so in order to make the whole, resolve the whole situation, and that's how they describe it, we're eager to fix this situation. They arrive at the unorthodox decision to use a trial by water. This is a misnomer. It's not a trial. I'm going to use a modern legal term, and I apologize to any lawyers who know more lawyer things than I do. But this is more like an evidentiary hearing. This is essentially an effort to find evidence. This was not going to condemn her at the time, but it could be used to condemn her depending how it went, if that makes sense. But this is based off the medieval belief that water as a pure element repels evil. So if you have a witch, a thief, a murderer, and somebody who has done something wrong that sins, and you put them in water, they're going to be essentially thrown out of the water, and they're going to bob and float in the water. By the time we get to the 1700s, it's almost exclusively associated with witchcraft, and this is where it has been most used. And it has a dubious history. even though we tend to think of it as, thanks to Monty Python and a bunch of other things, as the way people tested for witches. It certainly was. It was very often used by vigilante mobs who felt the courts weren't doing enough against suspected witches, so they were often sort of community affairs rather than formal affairs. But it did have a questionable value. For literally centuries by this point, plenty of skeptics who, again, may have believed in witchcraft were basically saying this doesn't work. And you have people going, well, what if the person's like, you're always tied when you're thrown in? What if the person like sort of gets on their back and just sort of flails around a little bit? What if their sort of body makeup makes them more likely to essentially float? A lot of times, to avoid allowing the person to drown, it's a sort of misremembrance that the innocent were just left to drown, and they would say, oh, God got them, they're fine. Nobody was supposed to die. And so you often had them not only tied, but they would be held by ropes. And so what happens for example, here, if these people are holding the rope so tight that it basically prevents the person from getting in the water, right? Imagine how panicked the sort of poor people are going to be, because you don't want to mess this whole thing up. And so what if you're pulling it too tight? There's a guy in Connecticut who was witnessing a vigilante mob doing this to a woman, and he basically said, tie me up and throw me in. No, everybody knows I'm not a witch, and I'll prove how stupid this is. Like, I'll prove how this could go wrong. In the case of England, it was particularly dubious because during the English Civil War, a Puritan zealot named Matthew Hopkins proclaimed himself Witchfinder General of England, and took it upon himself to eradicate witchcraft in England, and initiated the worst witch hunts in English history. Over a span of about 2 years, he killed 300 women with him and his followers. And his preferred method of testing for witches was ducking. And many drowned during these impromptu trials. And so because the Puritans ended up eventually losing the sort of war when it came to the Civil War, they won temporarily, but the crown comes back. What ended up happening is this gets a dubious reputation. So I think this is a sign of desperation on behalf of the Princess Anne County Court that they're doing this as their final test. But I think it also, again, context matters, can make sense, because even though ducking for witchcraft is rare, it's the only case we know in Virginia where it happened. It was formally used very often to punish women who were seen as problems in the community. Remember, husbands have to represent their wives in court, and this means if your wife gets sued, you have to pay the fine. And Virginia finally got so frustrated with all of the women being sued for slander, they passed a law that said, all right, husbands, instead of paying the fine, you can have your wife publicly ducked and shamed. And as she'll be ducked until she essentially formally recants and apologizes for being a problem, and then we can all resolve the matter. And so this means, as much as this was seen as a test for witchcraft, to people that are observing, this is also a signal of this is how we deal with women who are problems in our community. And even if they don't think that Grace Sherwood is a witch, by this point, she's been in court a lot with conflict with her neighbors, and you can tell the judges are tired of seeing her face in court. And so this is a way, again, of sort of signaling to the community that they're dealing with her. Unfortunately for her, she failed her trial by water. According to records, she floated contrary to nature. And the doubly unfortunate thing is we don't know what happens next. The court records for this basically say this is enough evidence to prevent her acquittal. And so she's essentially remanded to the county jail to, quote, await future trial. We have no idea if that trial takes place. We know it doesn't happen in Princess Anne County. There is nothing else related to this in their records. What that signals is they probably packaged everything up and wanted the attorney general to make the final decision about what to do with this strange case. Unfortunately, as many of you may know, the general court records were burned in the Civil War. And so we have no records from the colonial general court. We have no idea what they may or may not have heard, not just about this, but about anything. That said, again, I think there are plenty of, to use a phrase I like to use with this, dogs that aren't barking that signal Grace Sherwood was not prosecuted in the general court. Though if you go to Colonial Williamsburg, there's a very fantastic trial show called Try Witch that shows how courts worked, that reenacts the theoretical trial that may have taken place. But I'll walk through 3 pieces of evidence that I think hint that she was not formally tried in Williamsburg. The first is, even though we don't have general court records, the governor and his council were among the most well-connected people in England. They spent lots of time not only writing England and English relatives, but dealing with business contacts. And those have been scoured by historians who use it to study what life was like during this time. And not one person has found any of these people make a side mention about, oh, and by the way, we had this weird trial for witchcraft. And I feel like this is exceptional enough at this point in time. It would have been an aside. They might have mentioned it about like things that are going on. The two other things are the fact that if you were to look also, because of how these trials worked, you would have to basically, the county would have to send up Grace Sherwood. They would have to send 6 of the 12 jurors. They would have to send any witnesses. And all of that had to be paid for by either whomever lost the case or by the county. And there are no records in Princess Anne County related to paying for expenses related to this or selecting jurors to send up. All of that would have been done in a normal court session, and there's nothing there. And so that signals, again, she probably wasn't sent there. I think the other sort of dog not barking is we have to go back to the Attorney General's original assessment of the case. He said, I need a charge and I need evidence. Well, the charge hasn't gotten any more specific. And more importantly, the only evidence they have is, well, we searched her again after she was ducked and found those marks. And she floated when we put her in water. That's not really good evidence, especially if you're already a little jittery about doing a formal trial in the first place. And so my suspicion is that the Attorney General either dismissed it outright and refused to bring it forward, or the grand jury refused to indict her. And so what that meant is that she basically was in her county jail for a few months while they were deciding what to do next. We do know that she was back on her farm by 1708, and that's because she sued again for not paying debts. And so she has to have been sort of on her farm to where she could borrow money then not pay it back. Also signaled in there, they have to get the sheriff to get her a lot of times because it's hard for her to get up there. If she was still imprisoned or being punished in some way, they would know where she was. And so she does get the title to her land back in 1715. Essentially, she pays back taxes. And she lives until 1740 and dies at about the age of 80. She doesn't prosper, though. She has several debt suits. Her sons have some debt suits, but she lives to 1740. In case you're curious, she also outlives all of her accusers, so good for her. Last man standing was Anthony Barnes, who made it to 90. He died a few years before she did. And given the death trap colonial Virginia was, he is a hardy guy to make it to 90, having lived decades there. But then, so the question, this is where I'm going to wrap up for my final 10 minutes, if you'll indulge me. The question is, well, how does she become Virginia's most famous witch? And in fact, I could rattle off a whole series of other accused Virginia witches that none of you will know. A lot of you may have heard the name Grace Sherwood before, though. So why is she the most famous case in Virginia history? And it all really has to do with that original name I started with, which is witch duck. So in a world where you don't have newspapers, you don't have letters, you don't have things that remember your past for you, how do you know what happened? Well, stories. So imagine a world where by the time you get to the 19th century, everybody who may have seen her ducking's dead, but you have that name witch duck. And folklorists have shown that, and this is a quote from, I'll come back to this in a second. Nathaniel Hawthorne is in The House of the Seven Gables very famously said that strange tales are sure to spring up for ages afterward, like the toadstools that indicate where the fallen and buried trunk of a tree has long since moldered into the earth. They are tradition, which sometimes brings down truth that is history, or that history is let slip, but is oftener the wild babble of the time, such as was formerly spoken at the fireside and now congeals in newspapers. I will be less eloquent and just say, as folklorists have noticed, sometimes all it takes is a weird tree, a weird rock, or a weird name, and people are going to tell legends about it. And so you have something called witch duck. Nobody knows what that means. So obviously a witch was duck there. And so the area started telling stories. They may not even known the name was Grace Sherwood. It may have completely evaporated into the past. But in 1833, this very space where you are, the Virginia Historical Society, can take credit for catapulting Grace Sherwood into fame because they were the first to publish records related to her trial. And that's because a very diligent man named John Burroughs, who is the Princess Anne County court clerk in the mid-19th century, was hand transcribing all of the earliest records because they were in danger of being lost. I also want to extend a personal gratitude to him because they are much easier to read than the 17th century handwriting. But he is a local to the area. And from these records, he mentions this happened near Witch's Duck, so he knows the name. And what I imagine happened is now that he's doing this, he's like, let's see if I can find that witch. And he gets those 5 pages related to her ducking, and he sends it to a friend who gets in touch with the president of the Virginia Historical Society, who looks at it and says, this is amazing. This is proof that witchcraft is outside of New England. And so they printed it in their first collection of documents to much fanfare. And this became an instant sensation, not only for the Virginia Historical Society, but also for literary journals at the time. And they wanted to repackage and tell this story. The problem is there's not a lot of depth there. Why was she accused? What was she like? What do people think she could do? All that's missing. But what do you have? You have all those legends people have been telling. And so from the beginning, those get folded into the story to spice up what is otherwise a relatively dry affair. One of the earliest is in 1888. A Virginia novelist named John Easton Cook summarizes the case for Harper's Magazine, and he becomes, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he becomes the first to share the legend that locals said Grace Sherwood sailed in an eggshell boat, that basically she shrank herself and sailed in an eggshell. One of the most famous legends about Grace Sherwood. And so he folds this into the story and says they accused her of sailing in an eggshell boat. That's why she was accused of being a witch. Well, the local paper, the Virginian Pilot in the 20s, even says this. So as their subheading, she was charged with sailing in an eggshell. My favorite thing, notice they also say she drowned. The reporter off on a lot of details. My favorite thing about this is if you can read through the blurb, which you can't read this, but if you go online, the reporter says, well, records will prove. And he says all of these things that are obviously legends because he hasn't read the records that are in the courthouse. But what happened is he went to the Witch Duck area and somebody told him the records show these things. And so literally from this point forward, legend and history have been intertwined. And if you were to go through I'll give you just some examples. A Presbyterian minister and local historian named W.H.T. Squires collected not only the history of her trial, but a history of legends told about her in a 1928 book, The Days of Yesteryear. The local circuit court judge named Benjamin Dye White was a huge fan of Grace Sherwood and her cultural legacy. And he actually went to a farm rumored to belong to her and took a section of fence that was said to be hers, the hardiest cypress wood you could imagine to survive from the 1600s to now in the 1920s. And here you can see his wife standing in front of it. He put it in his garden and used it to grow his roses on. And because of the time, he was circuit court judge till the 40s. The house was used on home and garden tours. And we know from reports that they would tell stories about Grace Sherwood as the locals came by. And she lived until her 90s. And so she was telling stories until the 1960s. And then most famously of all, you have Louisa Venable Kyle's book, The Witch of Pungo, where she essentially popularizes these legends. And so, these stories are very much with us today, to where now you have this sort of popular image of Grace Sherwood as this beautiful, misunderstood, unconventional woman that very much pulls into a sort of history, things that are actually more legend than reality. But that's because, of course, you need, again, those facts and details. I am more than happy to answer any questions with the time that is left. I thank you for your wonderful attention. I know the book is in the gift shop if anybody is interested, and I'm more than happy to talk to you afterward also. Thank you.
I'm interested to find out what role the clergy at that time played in all of this.
So that's a really good question, because obviously Puritan clergy were essential in the New England colonies and perpetuating witch trials. And this is, I think in this case, they played very little because the Church of England was the established church, but they didn't do much to establish it, in the sense that there wasn't a seminary till William and Mary was built. And they often had to either force priests to come, who then often packed up and left because it was such a backwater, or they only sent the worst priests that they needed to get rid of. And so Princess Anne County, for example, had gaps of sometimes 8 to 10 years where they actually didn't have a minister, because they had trouble getting folks there. And so who's running the church? The vestry. Who are the vestrymen? The judges. And so, the same folks that were picked by the judge or the governor to be the judges of the county were picked by the county to do the vestry. What I can say, though, is that the sort of intense religiosity that inspired the New England witch trials didn't really filter here. This is more folk belief that's guiding that. And I think you can see that fact by the fact that the judges were very hesitant to move along with this process. One thing we know in general, not just in Virginia, but in general, is what it really takes to get people condemned of witchcraft is fervent belief by the judges and the administrators of the region. And so when those folks are convinced they're dealing with witches in their midst, that's when you get problems when it comes to prosecutions. Skeptical judges tend to be more skeptical to convict. And I think you can see that here. There was a lot of hesitation with moving forward on both the county and colony level.
Is there any indication of how she received the deed to her land back?
All we have is a land grant from the governor, and all it specifically states is that she will pay 2 pounds of tobacco per acre and get it back. And so it doesn't explicitly say why, but I think that's clearly back taxes. It's sort of a modern myth that this was some sort of apology for the trial that happened with witchcraft. That's how it often is depicted. Her losing her land had nothing to do with the allegation she was a witch, so that's why they're decoupled. But my guess is what happened is she petitioned the governor and said, I would like my land back. And he essentially said, okay, here's how you get it back. So she obviously was able to squirrel away enough resources to be able to pay for it.
Thank you. You mentioned a man accused of witchcraft who was, I think you said he was beaten and exiled.
Mm-hmm.
And this woman was ducked. What were other punishments that other people accused of witchcraft underwent? I mean, I'm from New England and I'm the hotbed. I mean, a woman from where I'm from North Andover, was burned as a witch. So I'm just curious because, as you said, it was much more violent up there. Mm-hmm. And so what were some of the other punishments of people accused of witchcraft? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So William Harding was the only person to actually be formally punished. So that's the only sort of case we have. Like I said, everybody else, they were slander suits. So there was no formal punishment for the person, even if they lost the case. And so Grace Sherwood was ducked. I would argue again, less because they thought she was, well, they needed to find evidence, but I would say it was more of a signal of her as a sort of problematic woman, which was very common punishment and sort of ritual humiliation of women that were seeing challenging norms. The official punishment for felony witchcraft was death. But it was not implemented in Virginia at any time. And misdemeanor witchcraft could be punished by a year in jail, but obviously the Northumberland County Court did something different. There are 3 cases that we know of that are the only known executions for witchcraft outside of New England and England's North American colonies, but they were all lynch mobs that hanged women over the seas. And so in those cases, they believed that the storms that were threatening their voyage were being provoked by a witch on board. And so they essentially targeted a woman they thought was a witch on board and hanged her. And so there are 3 cases where that happened. But it happened sort of transatlantically, and it was dealt with by the Admiralty courts when they got here, sort of having to deal with that. And actually, the captains were often punished for allowing that to happen.
I thought it was a little curious that she didn't maybe fit the profile of a typical witch, even having children. Is there any kind of witnesses for the defense or anybody who would stand up for someone who was accused?
So in her case, we don't know, or the transcripts don't list anybody other than her in the hills, so that neither side brought witnesses. That said, and because of the way North American colonies were, because their populations were younger, accused witches in North America actually tended to be younger. They tended to be in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and they tended to have families and things like that. So in fact, she actually sort of matches that the sort of standard profile of a North American accused witch. It has to do more with community reputation and with essentially a sort of socioeconomic condition, and in this case, more than age.
Okay, everyone. I think that's all we have time for. So let's give Scott another round.